The company will be in good hands, Justin's hands. And Nicole? Well, maybe she can try Burger Stop, my dad announced, raising his glass at what was supposed to be his retirement dinner. The room erupted in laughter, but all I could hear was the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I sat there, stunned, my face burning with humiliation as everyone at the table, colleagues, family friends, business partners, laughed at my expense. My name is Nicole Chambers. I'm 30 years old, and for the past 10 years, I've been the backbone of Chambers Distribution Company in Portland, Oregon. While my brother Justin was out partying and burning through Dad's money on failed startups, I was the one pulling all-nighters, managing our biggest accounts, and keeping our operations running smoothly. I was the one who negotiated the deal that saved us from bankruptcy 3 years ago. I was the one who modernized our systems and increased our profits by 40%. But apparently, none of that mattered, because I wasn't born with the right anatomy. She'd probably ruin that too, Justin added with a smug grin, taking another sip of his expensive wine. More laughter filled the private dining room of the Grand Hotel. I watched as my father beamed with pride at his son's wit, the same son who had crashed 2 startups in the past 5 years and had only shown up to the office maybe 20 times in the last year. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. This wasn't just a joke. This was my father publicly declaring that 10 years of dedication, loyalty, and results meant nothing. That I meant nothing. I forced a smile and nodded, playing the part of the dutiful daughter who knew her place. But inside, something was shifting. A cold, calculated anger was taking root. As I looked around the table at the faces of people I'd worked with for years, people who were now laughing at the idea of my professional incompetence, I realized something crucial. They had no idea what was coming. None of them knew about the meetings I'd been having for the past 6 months, the quiet conversations with minority shareholders, the careful documentation of every transaction. They thought they were witnessing my humiliation, but what they were actually seeing was the beginning of their downfall. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip, meeting my father's eyes across the table. "You're absolutely right, Dad," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "The company does need to be in good hands." The smile on his face faltered slightly at something in my tone, but he quickly recovered, raising his glass higher, as if my agreement validated his decision. Little did he know, I had already made sure the company would indeed be in very good hands. Mine. Growing up as Robert Chambers' daughter meant growing up in the shadow of expectations I could never meet. From the time I was old enough to understand, it was clear that Justin was the golden child, the heir apparent to the family business. He was 3 years older than me, and our father treated him like a prince from day one. When Justin showed interest in baseball, Dad bought him the best equipment money could buy. When Justin struggled in math, Dad hired the best tutors. When Justin wanted to start a business right out of college, Dad handed him a trust fund worth $200,000. Me? I had to fight for every opportunity. When I graduated summa cum laude from Oregon State with a degree in business administration, Dad said it was nice, but that the real world would be different. When I asked to join the company, he made me start in the mailroom. When I proved myself there and asked to move up, he said I needed to earn my stripes in customer service. It took me 3 years to work my way up to a position that Justin probably could have walked into on day one, but I persevered because I genuinely loved the business. Chambers Distribution Company wasn't just a job to me. It was legacy, tradition, something worth preserving and growing. We specialized in medical supply distribution across the Pacific Northwest, and I believed in the importance of what we did. When hospitals needed critical supplies, we were the ones who made sure they got them on time. It mattered. Justin, on the other hand, saw the company as his personal piggy bank. After college, instead of joining the family business like everyone expected, he announced he was an entrepreneur and started his first company, a social media platform for pet owners that burned through his trust fund in 18 months. Dad just laughed it off as learning experiences and funded his next venture, a food delivery app that lasted even less time. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks, building relationships with suppliers, streamlining our logistics, and actually growing the business. When our biggest client threatened to leave due to delivery issues, I personally drove to Seattle at midnight to solve the problem. When we were facing a cash flow crisis, I was the one who restructured our payment terms and negotiated extended credit with our suppliers. When our outdated computer system was causing inventory nightmares, I researched and implemented a new platform that saved us hundreds of thousands of dollars. But no matter what I accomplished, Dad always found ways to diminish it. Nicole did well on the Peterson account, he'd tell people. But of course, Peterson's always been easy to work with. Or, Nicole's computer thing is working out okay, but we'll see how it handles real pressure. There was always a qualifier, always a way to make my successes seem smaller. Still, I held on to hope that eventually, merit would win out. That eventually Dad would see that I was the one keeping his company alive and thriving. Tonight's announcement shattered that illusion completely. The realization that I would never be enough, no matter what I accomplished, hit me like a physical blow 6 months ago during a board meeting. It was a routine quarterly review, but Dad had insisted that Justin attend, his first board meeting in 2 years. I had just finished presenting our best quarterly results in company history, a 22% increase in revenue, 3 major new contracts, and the successful launch of our emergency medical supply rapid response service. The board members were impressed, asking detailed questions about my strategies and implementation timelines. I felt confident, proud even, as I explained how we'd captured market share from our biggest competitor by focusing on reliability and customer service. This was my moment, I thought. This was when Dad would finally see that I was ready for more responsibility, maybe even a pathway to leadership. But when the presentation ended and the board members were congratulating me, Dad stood up with a big smile and said, "Of course, Justin's been instrumental in Nicole's success here. His entrepreneurial mindset has really helped guide her thinking." I stared at him in disbelief. Justin had contributed exactly nothing to any of these initiatives. He hadn't even been in the office during most of the quarter. Justin, to his credit, looked embarrassed and started to correct Dad. But our father continued. "In fact, I think it's time we started talking about bringing Justin on board in a more official capacity. Maybe as Vice President of Strategic Development." The room fell silent. Even the board members looked confused. They had just witnessed my presentation of transformative results, and Dad was talking about promoting the son who hadn't been present for any of it. That's when it clicked for me. This wasn't about merit, performance, or even business sense. This was about Dad's vision of how the world should work, and in that vision, men led and women supported. I could run the company better than anyone else in the room, and deep down, I think Dad knew that, but he would never allow it to happen. Walking out of that meeting, I felt something inside me break and then immediately reform into something harder, more determined. If Dad wasn't going to recognize my value through traditional channels, I would have to create my own path. That's when I started making phone calls. Chambers Distribution Company had been family-owned for 30 years, but Dad had sold minority stakes to various investors over the years to fund expansion. Together, these minority shareholders owned 49% of the company, while Dad retained 51%. What most people didn't realize was that these shareholders were getting frustrated with the company's direction, or lack thereof. They'd watched Justin's expensive failures, and they'd seen the company stagnate under Dad's increasingly outdated management style. I started reaching out to them, one by one, not as Robert Chambers' daughter, but as the woman who had been quietly keeping their investment profitable. I had a proposition for them, one that would change everything. The months following that board meeting were the most challenging of my professional life, but also the most empowering. I had to maintain my regular duties at the company while secretly negotiating the most important deal of my career. Every conversation had to be carefully planned, every meeting strategically timed. I couldn't afford for Dad or Justin to suspect what I was building. My first approach was to Margaret Foster, who owned 15% of the company. She was a retired nurse who had invested her pension with Dad 12 years ago because she believed in our mission of medical supply distribution. When I called her, I didn't mention my family dynamics at all. Instead, I focused on business. "Margaret, I've been analyzing our growth potential, and I think we're leaving money on the table," I told her over coffee at a quiet cafe downtown. "With the right leadership and strategic vision, we could triple our market share in 5 years." She listened intently as I outlined my plans. Expanding into rural healthcare markets, developing partnerships with medical equipment manufacturers, and creating a subscription service for routine supplies that would provide steady, predictable revenue. These weren't pipe dreams. I had already done the research, run the numbers, and even had preliminary conversations with potential partners. "This sounds remarkable, Nicole," Margaret said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "But what does your father think about these expansion plans?" I took a deep breath. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. I don't think Dad is interested in this level of growth anymore. He's talking about retirement, and he's planning to hand control to Justin." I let that sink in for a moment. Margaret knew Justin's track record. "I see," she said slowly. "And you think you could implement these changes if you had more influence in the company?" "I know I could. But I need partners who share my vision. People who want to see their investment grow rather than just maintain the status quo." By the end of our conversation, Margaret was intrigued. She didn't commit to anything specific, but she agreed to think about it. More importantly, she gave me the names of 2 other shareholders who might be interested in discussing the company's future. The next few months were a delicate dance of building relationships and trust. I met with David Thompson, who owned 18%, and Patricia Wells, who owned 16%. Each conversation was carefully crafted to focus on business fundamentals rather than family drama. I presented detailed market analyses, financial projections, and strategic plans. I showed them how my initiatives over the past 3 years had consistently outperformed industry benchmarks. The breakthrough came when Patricia asked me directly, "Nicole, are you proposing some kind of management buyout?" I had prepared for this moment, but my heart still raced as I answered. "I'm proposing that the shareholders who actually care about this company's future take control of its direction. If you're willing to sell your shares to someone who will work full-time to maximize their value, then yes." The negotiations were complex. Each shareholder had different concerns, different timelines, and different financial needs. Margaret wanted assurance that the company's mission would remain intact. David was primarily interested in return on investment and wanted to see detailed financial projections. Patricia was concerned about the legal implications and insisted on having her lawyer review everything. But slowly, carefully, I built consensus. I offered fair market value for their shares, actually slightly above current market value, funded through a combination of my savings, a business loan, and seller financing arrangements. More importantly, I demonstrated that I had a clear vision for growth and the track record to execute it. The legal paperwork was handled by Thomas Mitchell, a corporate attorney I had worked with on supplier contracts. He understood the importance of discretion and helped structure the deals to close simultaneously, preventing any single transaction from triggering disclosure requirements that might alert Dad to what was happening. By the time I sat down at that retirement dinner, I held 51% of Chambers Distribution Company. I was the majority owner of the business I had been building for 10 years. The irony of Dad's retirement dinner wasn't lost on me. He had chosen the Grand Hotel's private dining room, specifically to make a statement. This was an important occasion, worthy of ceremony and witnesses. He wanted everyone to see him passing the torch to his chosen successor. What he didn't realize was that he was providing me with the perfect stage for my own announcement. As I sat there listening to him toast Justin's future leadership, I watched the faces around the table. There was Margaret Foster, who had arrived as my guest. Dad assumed she was there because of her long business relationship with the company, not knowing she was now my business partner. David Thompson was nodding politely, but I caught his eye briefly and saw the hint of a smile. Patricia Wells maintained her poker face perfectly, occasionally glancing at her phone where she had the signed transfer documents saved. The guest list read like a who's who of Portland's business community. Frank Harrison from Pacific Medical Group, our largest client. Jennifer Walsh from the Chamber of Commerce. Several vendors, competitors, and industry colleagues. Dad had wanted witnesses to Justin's coronation, and he was about to get them. Just not the way he intended. You know, Dad continued, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled everything. Building a business isn't just about hard work. It's about vision, leadership, and the ability to make tough decisions. That's why I know Justin will take this company to new heights. Justin, for his part, was eating up the attention. He stood and raised his own glass, playing the part of the humble heir apparent. I'm honored by Dad's confidence, he said, his voice slightly slurred from the pre-dinner drinks. I have big plans for Chambers distribution. We're going to disrupt the industry, bring some real innovation to this old-school business. I almost laughed at that. Justin's idea of innovation was usually whatever he'd read about in the latest business magazine. But the room applauded politely, and Dad beamed with pride. The speeches continued for another 20 minutes. Dad talked about the company's history, its values, its bright future under Justin's leadership. Justin outlined his vision for modernizing operations, though his ideas were vague and clearly hadn't been thought through. Various guests offered congratulations and well wishes. Through it all, I remained calm and composed, occasionally nodding or smiling at appropriate moments. Inside, though, I was calculating timing. I needed to let Dad finish his presentation completely before I made my move. This wasn't just about business. It was about ensuring that everyone in this room understood exactly what had just happened. When Dad finally sat down, clearly satisfied with his performance, I quietly signaled to Thomas Mitchell, who was seated near the back of the room. He stood and cleared his throat loudly enough to get everyone's attention. Excuse me, Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority that comes with 30 years of corporate law practice. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's actually a business matter that needs to be addressed this evening. The room fell silent. Dad looked confused and slightly annoyed at the interruption to his celebration. Justin's smile faded as he sensed something was off. I represent several shareholders of Chambers Distribution Company, Thomas continued, pulling out a folder of documents. As of 3 p.m. today, there has been a change in ownership structure that affects the company's leadership transition. I watched Dad's face as the implications began to dawn on him. His confusion was transforming into something closer to alarm as he realized that whatever was happening, he hadn't authorized it. The silence in the room was deafening as Thomas Mitchell opened his folder and adjusted his reading glasses. Every eye was on him, but I felt the weight of the moment settling around me like a mantle. This was it. The culmination of 6 months of careful planning, strategic thinking, and quiet determination. As of this afternoon, Thomas announced, his voice steady and professional. Miss Nicole Chambers has acquired controlling interest in Chambers Distribution Company through the purchase of minority shareholder stakes. She now owns 51% of the company and, as majority shareholder, has the authority to make executive decisions regarding company leadership. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Dad's wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering against his plate with a sharp crash that seemed to echo in the stunned silence. His face went completely white, then flushed red as the blood rushed back. Justin's mouth actually fell open, and he stared at me as if I had just announced I was an alien from another planet. That's impossible, Dad stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Those shares, I would have had to approve any transfers. Actually, no, sir, Thomas replied calmly. The minority shareholders have always had the right to sell their stakes to qualified buyers. Miss Chambers negotiated directly with each shareholder, Margaret Foster, David Thompson, and Patricia Wells, and purchased their combined 49% stake. Additionally, She has exercised an option to purchase an additional 2% from the employee stock ownership plan, giving her majority control. I finally stood up, feeling calmer than I had in months. All those sleepless nights, all those carefully worded conversations, all those legal documents and financial arrangements had led to this moment. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'd like to address everyone here tonight." The room was still frozen in shock. Frank Harrison was leaning forward in his chair, clearly trying to process what this meant for his contracts with us. Jennifer Walsh had her phone out, probably already composing messages to her contacts. Dad was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. A mixture of betrayal, disbelief, and something that might have been respect. "For the past 10 years, I began, looking around the table at each face, I have dedicated myself to building this company, not just working for it, but actually building it into something stronger, more efficient, and more profitable than it has ever been. I've done this because I believe in what we do, and I believe in our mission of supporting healthcare providers across the Pacific Northwest." Justin tried to interrupt. "Nicole, what are you— This is crazy. You can't just—" I held up my hand, and to my surprise, he actually stopped talking. There was something in my expression, perhaps, that made him realize this wasn't a joke or a stunt. Tonight was supposed to be about transition and succession. I continued. "Dad, you talked about the importance of vision, leadership, and making tough decisions. I agree completely. That's exactly why I've spent the last 6 months ensuring that this company's future is secure." I turned to look directly at my father, this man who had shaped my entire life through his expectations and disappointments. "You said the company needs to be in good hands. You're absolutely right. As of today, it is." The room erupted. Dad was sputtering something about lawyers and challenges. Justin was demanding to know how I had gotten the money. Several guests were talking at once, their voices overlapping in a chaos of confusion and excitement. But I remained standing calmly at my place, watching it all unfold. I had planned for this moment, and now it was time to see it through to the end. The chaos at the table continued for several minutes before I raised my voice loud enough to cut through the noise. "If I could have everyone's attention, please, there are a few more things that need to be addressed tonight." Gradually, the room quieted down, though Dad continued to mutter under his breath about ungrateful children and legal challenges. Justin was frantically texting someone, probably his lawyer, though I doubted there was anything he could do at this point. "First," I said, looking directly at Dad, "I want to formally accept your resignation from Chambers Distribution Company, effective immediately. Thomas has prepared the necessary paperwork to make this transition official." Dad's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "I didn't resign. This is some kind of corporate coup." "Actually," Thomas interjected smoothly, "Mr. Chambers announced his retirement quite clearly this evening, in front of multiple witnesses. Miss Chambers, as majority owner, is simply accepting that resignation and implementing immediate succession planning." The legal maneuvering was beautiful in its simplicity. Dad had announced his retirement publicly, in front of a room full of witnesses. While he might have intended it to be ceremonial, with the actual transition happening later, I was holding him to his words. He had stepped down. I was stepping up. "Second," I continued, "I want to thank everyone here tonight for your support of Chambers Distribution Company over the years. I look forward to continuing our business relationships and building even stronger partnerships going forward." Frank Harrison was the first to recover from his shock. He stood and raised his glass with a slight smile. "Well, this certainly wasn't what I expected tonight, but congratulations, Nicole. The company has been in excellent hands with your involvement, and I'm confident it will continue to thrive." That seemed to break the spell for the rest of the room. Several other guests began offering congratulations. Some clearly hedged their bets by immediately shifting their allegiance to the new power structure. Margaret Foster was beaming with pride, and David Thompson actually winked at me. But not everyone was ready to accept the new reality. Justin finally found his voice. And when he did, his response was exactly what I had expected. "This is insane," he shouted, standing up so quickly his chair fell backward. "You can't just steal the family business. Dad, we have to fight this. We have lawyers. We have resources." I looked at my brother. This man who had coasted through life on charm and Dad's checkbook, who had never worked a full week in his life, who had somehow convinced himself that he deserved to inherit what I had built, and felt nothing but pity. "Justin," I said quietly, "you're welcome to contest this legally. But before you do, you should understand a few things. First, every transaction was completely legal and properly documented. Thomas has been working with some of the best corporate attorneys in the state to ensure everything was done by the book." I paused, letting that sink in. "Second, you should know that as majority owner, I have the authority to make immediate changes to company structure and personnel. Effective Monday morning, your consulting contract with the company is terminated." Justin's face went pale. He had been drawing $20,000 a month as a strategic consultant for the past 2 years, despite contributing virtually nothing to the company's operations. That money had been funding his lifestyle, his apartment in the Pearl District, his expensive car. "You can't do that," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier bluster. "Actually, I can. And I am." I turned to address the room one final time. "I want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight. I hope you'll understand that I need to have some private conversations with my family now." The message was clear. The public portion of this evening was over. The guests began filing out, many stopping to offer their congratulations or express their continued support for the company. Within 10 minutes, the room was empty except for family and Thomas Mitchell. Now came the hard part. In the months that followed, the consequences of that evening rippled through every aspect of our family's life. Dad retreated from the business community entirely, too humiliated to show his face at industry events where everyone knew the story of how his daughter had outmaneuvered him. He sold his house in the West Hills and moved to a small condo in Bend, claiming he wanted a simpler life, but everyone knew he couldn't afford his previous lifestyle without the company income. Justin's attempts to launch a business podcast called Disrupting Dynasty failed spectacularly when he could barely book guests, and his bitter rants about family betrayal alienated what few listeners he attracted. Without his consulting income, he had to move back in with Dad, and last I heard, he was working at a car dealership, trying to charm customers into buying extended warranties. As for me, I sat in my father's old office, now mine, looking out at the Portland skyline and reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The revenge had been sweet, but more than that, it had been necessary. Sometimes you have to build your own table if no one will give you a seat at theirs, and sometimes you have to take control of your own story instead of letting others write it for you. In the end, I had learned that the most powerful revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. It's about building something so successful that their absence becomes irrelevant.